All right, so if you are a regular watcher of this channel, then you probably remember a time when your parents were afraid that giving their credit card number to eBay would like trigger Y2K or something. And I mean, in retrospect, they actually were kind of right to keep it a buck. But you look at that, grown-ups actually knowing what they're talking about. Well, now we're the ones getting calls from fake area codes selling warranties for cars that were repoed 2 years ago, all because some piece of face geek in Chile got our name, address, and phone number from Ticketmaster. And that actually happened, by the way, to over 600 million people. Not the repo part. I don't know. Maybe it did. I'm taking creative license here, but y'all get my point. And because this is America after all, the poor defenseless billion-dollar corporation plans to do exactly jack and all about potentially hundreds of millions of people being defrauded because they just wanted to have good seats for WrestleMania this year. And that's where today's sponsor, Aura, comes in. Aura alerts you when your data has been part of a breach or leaked on the dark web. It also gives you fast fraud alerts if anyone tries to use that data to access your credit or bank accounts. And it removes your information from data broker websites so you get fewer spam calls. You also get things like transaction monitoring, a VPN, antivirus, a password manager, parental controls, and identity theft insurance. And you get this all in one app at one affordable price. Would you look at that, looking out for us in this economy? Maybe Aura should be running for president this year. Lord knows we can't do any worse. So if you do want to stop these annoying spam calls and protect your neck in the process, go to aura.com/Lil Bill and get 14 days free on me. Not on me, but y'all understand what I'm saying. Just go to the link, man, and get your free trial, bucko. I know you like free stuff. You want to be on YouTube otherwise. Again, go to aura.com/Lil Bill or just click the link in the description below. Protect your neck and your pockets today. I promise you won't regret it. Can't say the same about this video. Just like I can't say the same about this shirt. I'm officially in my old head era, folks. What can I say? It was a gift, man. I gotta wear it at least once. All right, so it's pretty well established at this point that I am an OG Drake hater, going all the way back to the days of So Far Gone. Because I was still in high school at the time, though, and I was already like 2 toes deep into hardcore and grunge bands, I couldn't quite put my finger on why this nigga rubbed me so raw back then. Was it the fact that all of the R&B girlies that I had tried macking to like the year prior using songs like Slow Jams and Miss Fat Booty all of a sudden decided that they were hip hop heads after Best I Ever Had dropped? Was it the fact that Drake's Rise was the most transparent campaign to make pop rap the sound of the era in like a decade at least? Or was it just the fact that this nigga was not only not from the hood, but not even American? It was all of that, to be honest. What can I say? I was shallower than a petri dish back then. That said, as I'll spend the next like hour plus arguing, for as far back as the early 90s at least, there's always been a Drake-like figure in hip-hop, and I never felt the kind of contempt for any of them as I did for Aubrey. It wasn't until we were like a few years deep into BLM, as a matter of fact, specifically after the murder of Alton Shepard, that I finally figured out what irked me about this man so much. It was the fact that despite his heritage, he is not one of us and never really made any effort to be unless and until it was beneficial. Drake is the logical conclusion of hip hop's at the time like 40-year march toward complete commodification and thereby severance from black identity completely. Well, not complete severance. That was supposed to be Jack Harlow until even the white folks realized that they had gone too far with that one.
I think there's a chance Jack Harlow lost and the Lions lost when the decision was made to put that shit on the field at halftime.
That said, I want to make it clear that Drake was not an accident, not by a long shot, and nor did he happen overnight. Like I've said a few times now, one of the most common misconceptions about hip-hop's history is that it was largely, even exclusively, an underground phenomenon for the first, like, 10 or 15 years of its existence, and even beyond that. But that's just not true, to keep it a buck. And to really do that point justice, I suggest that y'all go look up the work of Dr. Jared Ball on the subject, a friend of the channel, and more importantly, an old head who actually has something to say about the old days that's worth listening to. So the complete opposite of FD. Yeah, this beef is still hotter than a sidewalk in summertime, nigga. Rather, what I'm going to attempt to do today is understand exactly how we got to Drake in the first place, and perhaps just as importantly, why Drake being the de facto flag bearer for the genre is problematic beyond his own indiscretions. So yeah, let's tune up the band, Clarence. Okay, so in order to understand how Drake came to be, we have to understand what Drake actually is. He is the hip-hop equivalent of a rock star, basically. The rock star, in fact. Every era of every mainstream American music genre has at least one, sometimes multiple ones at one time. It's what Elvis was to 50s rock and roll, or the Beatles in the decade following. The fulcrum around which that genre, and thereby the culture that informs that genre, pivots. But that then begs the question, how do we determine who or what the fulcrum is? If you're watching this video, then there's a better than good chance that you heard of something called the culture industry. I don't mean for this to be that kind of video, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. Y'all should watch FD's Kid and Play video for more information on that. But TLDR, it is the idea that most of what we call popular culture is basically an assembly line of easily digestible but ultimately inconsequential ideas passing themselves off as art. But really it's just commodity. It's not really meant to challenge or engage your brain beyond a quick hit of dopamine to convince you that one, life ain't really as bad as it seems so long as you're able to keep consuming, and two, you most definitely need to keep on consuming, bucko, like your life depended on it. Because it does. Basically, every major entertainment industry is designed to force feed us junk food until we're convinced it's steak and lobster, simply because we don't know any better. And I mean, Ice Spice has entered the chat once again. Damn, girl, don't you got something better to do? And I mean, for as much as the Frankfurt School has influenced my personal philosophy, my argument has always been that if we are in a state of false consciousness, it is of our own volition. Again, this ain't that video, but my point with all of that is to reiterate what I said before, that hip hop, or at least its gatekeepers, have always wanted a piece of that culture industry pie. And the gatekeepers always knew that doing so meant sacrificing at least a piece of hip hop's soul to do so. The problem is, for the first decade or so of its existence, hip-hop didn't really have a rock star to build and market itself around. I mean, you had your Curtis Blows, your Grandmaster Flashes, African Bambatas, and so forth. But this was during a time in which hip-hop was largely indistinguishable from disco and funk, which, yeah, did have their larger-than-life personalities, you know, your Bootsy Collinses, your George Clintons, and what have you, but was largely marketed around the culture itself and not any one person within it. And when those personalities did break through, they were just pop at that point. So Michael Jackson or Prince Chappelle, for example. The same goes for hip hop. Until our first candidate. Born in Bayshore, New York, but growing up in Queens, James Todd Smith had the kind of childhood that would be right at home on a Kendrick Lamar LP. When James was 4, his father shot and nearly killed his mother and grandfather, and it was James who found them covered in blood. Not long after, he and his mother moved in with his grandparents, but despite this, he was regularly abused by his mother's at the time boyfriend. Young James found solace in hip-hop music, and by the time he was 16, he was already creating his own mixtapes with the support of his grandparents and mother, who financed his efforts, and even his estranged father, who helped him navigate the business early on. Smith, who by this time had taken on the LL Cool J moniker, created a demo tape that he sent to basically all the New York record labels that he could find, including a pretty new one that had been started by a college-age Rick Rubin and the nastiest man alive, probably Russell Simmons. That label was Def Jam, and LL was signed there in 1984. In the same year, Def Jam released his debut single, I Need a Beat, which sold 100,000 copies and helped earn the label a distribution deal with Columbia Records, and perhaps more importantly, gave the label its first flagship artist. And this is where I want to pause and maybe back up just a little bit. A year prior, Profile Records released the most consequential single of probably the entirety of hip-hop's history, that being Run DMC's Like That, which introduced a harder, more macho and aggressively black brand of hip-hop that adopted the b-boy street style of the time and made that the de facto uniform of golden age hip-hop. Run DMC, along with LL, marked a clear distinction between hip-hop and the disco and funk bands that had inspired it. And while Run DMC definitely deserved the lion's share of credit for pioneering the hip-hop aesthetic and overall feel of the genre and culture, it was LL who, I'd argue, really defined the sound that defined the golden age.
LL Cool J! I'm feeling this. Now y'all ready to have some fun or what? Hands in the air from side to side, hands in the air from side to side. I think you know the drill, you know how we do this. But let me hear you say yeah! Say yeah! Now scream!
So I'm gonna keep it a buck with y'all. I didn't really listen to much of LL's catalog until researching for this video, but seriously, if you consider yourself a hip-hop fan of any era, you owe it to yourself to hear at least his first, second, and fourth albums. Not the third one, we'll come to that in a second. The braggadocious punchlines, the clever wordplay, the exaggerated swagger of inner city black youth is all right there. Punctuated by Ruben Sparks' production, Radio was the first hip-hop record where the MC was unequivocally the star of the show. This is where the best rapper alive crown actually starts to mean something and where the GOAT convo starts. I also do want to bring up the fact that LL never needed the local dope dealer to finance his music. We'll talk about this a little more in depth later, but until the internet basically killed the gatekeeper, most of your favorite MCs of yesteryear were no more than like a degree or two of separation away from the streets. I mean, this is the ghetto after all. LL was the polar opposite of that. As a matter of fact, he changed his name from J Ski to LL Cool J as not to be lumped in with the drug culture that was already becoming synonymous with hip hop, not unlike disco and funk a decade earlier, ironically enough. Point is, LL was as squeaky clean as it got. And no, I'm not just talking about the Chrome Dome. The reason why I bring that up is you got to remember, at this point, hip hop was at best seen as a fad, and worse than that, ghetto. LL, being as squeaky clean as he was the total package of that, plus his looks, his talent, and charisma. This is exactly what mainstream marketers wanted. The ladies loved him, and the guys at worst acknowledged his acumen and his just inherent coolness. He was the perfect storm of hip-hop credibility and top 40 marketability. Until that third album. The common misconception about LL's brief fall from grace is that it was the ballads that did it, but LL was doing ballads on his first album, and his biggest one was on his most successful album to that point. The issue with Walk with a Panther was that it was a transparent play at pop stardom. LL, or perhaps more accurately his handlers, had consciously watered down his overall sound to appeal to a top 40 palette. It didn't help that this happened right when street hop was starting to establish itself as a legit contender to being the dominant sound of the next decade, which it did. The thing is, record companies weren't really opposed to gangsta rap's takeover. I mean, this is capitalism after all. It was just that gangsta rap hadn't proven itself as commercially viable as the after-school special raps that were the norm of the time.
You make a lot of money and you make it fast. You get busted, you going straight to a jail cell.
But what NWA proved was that not only did the formula work, but that it was even more lucrative than the Will Smiths and the MC Hammers and the Kid and Plays, etc., or even the edgier B-boy bars that LL had become known for. LL was in danger of already being relegated to relic status before he was in his 30s, in part because of his more pop-friendly sound, but primarily because the public was moving on from him. And here's the first deviation from Drake I want to highlight about him. LL could have tried to ride the gangster rap gravy train to stay relevant, but he didn't. One thing that LL has always had that Drake never really did was personhood. He never tried jumping from identity to identity based on profitability. He's always been the nigga licking his lips in place of chapstick. He's always been the dude standing under a waterfall in jeans and a wife beater. He's always been the kid walking around the hood in cowboy boots and a Batman cowl. That was me, actually, but y'all get my point. Whatever. LL was always a little out there, let's put it that way. He's always been a meme. He's always kind of marched to the beat of his own drum. Even in the midst of his own self-doubt that he could stay relevant in the face of street hop's rise, LL stayed in his b-boy stance and clapped back in a way that was authentically him. Not only is that hip-hop, but it's punk as hell, man. That's what Mama Said Knock You Out was. It was LL declaring quite literally that he had never left, and he wasn't going anywhere until he damn well pleased. This is when LL's legacy as a hip-hop legend was secured, basically. And yeah, his sound did evolve with the times to become more R&B adjacent, but he was always LL for better or for weird. But there's the other key difference between LL Cool J and Drake. LL always saw himself as a rapper first, a rapper's rapper at that. Even to this day, the whole Godfather of pop rap thing kind of rubs him the wrong way. And I can see why. LL had a pretty purist idea of what hip hop was supposed to be and what a rapper should sound and carry themselves as. As far as he was concerned, LL wasn't so much a pop star as he was a rapper who just so happened to make pop hits from time to time. That's at least how he presented himself and how he would like to be remembered. Point being, there was never a point in his career where LL was not of the culture, and that's part of why he felt so distraught when street hop took over. He had never left the culture, but the culture was leaving him, and ergo without an identity. Drake, on the other hand, has always kind of wanted the culture's validation without the community that comes with it. Ask yourself this: when Drake does call it a career, what will his legacy really be? Hits? Will Smith has hits. So did Hammer. So did the Fat Boy. So did Kid and Play. Criss Cross. Lil Bow Wow was the biggest thing on the playground at one point, and at least he made Fresh As I'm Is. I know what it really is, and you probably know what it is too, but we'll save that for the end. My point is, to reduce LL's legacy to just his crossover appeal is honestly kind of disrespectful. And I can see why he feels a way about that. LL Cool J was more than just a crossover artist. He was hip-hop's first superstar lyricist. He was the first main event MC in mainstream consciousness. And he set the bar for the Rakims, the Jay-Z's, the Kendrick Lamars, and all who would follow and in many cases surpass him. The exaggerated swagger of black masculinity that defined hip-hop for the next 40 or so years was in large part thanks to LL Cool J. The point I think I wanted to get at is that the Drake comparisons do make sense, but they don't really tell the full story of LL Cool J's legacy, and they're pretty superficial, to keep it a buck. Additionally, we need to make it clear that LL's shrinking star power really had nothing to do with him, the love ballads or not. The public, and thereby the record labels, just fell in love with a new sound. As much as his fourth album did to cement his legacy, it didn't really do much in the big picture. By the end of the 80s and definitely by the early 90s, street hop had captured the public consciousness. And Mama Said Knock You Out was really the last gasp for b-boy rapping, by virtue the golden age of hip-hop. Or at least the first golden age. I really don't know how to divide these eras up. Whatever, nigga. By the mid-90s, LL himself was transitioning into acting while sounding more and more like an R&B act. But again, that was more so because the culture had already told him he was old news. For as many flowers as Straight Outta Compton, Enter the Wu-Tang, and Illmatic get and deserve for defining this decade's sound, if you ask me, the two most consequential albums to come out of this decade didn't come until halfway through it. Okay, so any of y'all who have followed this channel for any length of time know that I am no fan of Sean Carter for a variety of reasons that I've already spent hours talking about, so y'all can go look at my back catalog for those opinions. Jay-Z, on the other hand, if you ask me, is kind of quietly becoming one of the more underrated artists of at least my lifetime. And yeah, I know that's a pretty hot take, but separate the man from the music for a second. He's basically the LeBron James of rap music. Egregious lies and all. What I mean is, no one has put out as much quality as consistently or for as long as Jay-Z has. But the fact that people just don't like the nigga personally is the reason he doesn't really get the flowers I think he deserves. And also the fact that he lies like an arresting officer at a trial hearing. Like, seriously, Jay has given us nothing but classics for like the past 3 decades. Kingdom Come and Blueprint 3 notwithstanding. That said, why do niggas dislike Jay-Z so much?
What did he do to make them niggas that mad?
Well, to understand that, we gotta go back to where Jay grew up, or kind of where he grew up. I'll explain in a second. Sean Carter was born in the Bed-Stuy section of Brooklyn, more specifically in Marcy houses. And I mean, it's a typical black boy in the projects upbringing. Single mother, dope fiend neighbors, shooting your older brother in the shoulder for stealing your jewelry. It's the story of my life, basically. Except that last part. My brother is actually younger than me. Anyway, the part that a lot of y'all may not know, or maybe you do know, I don't know, it's right there on his wiki page, is that a significant chunk of Jay-Z's teenage years weren't spent in Brooklyn. They were actually spent in Trenton, New Jersey. Matter of fact, although he never actually showed up to class, he was enrolled at Central around the same time that my mother was. And more importantly, he ran the streets around the same time and place as some of my folks did. So yeah, my point is, the stories that I heard about Jay growing up from people who know better is, one, the reason why I talk so flippantly about him, and two, and more importantly, the thing that I've been trying to make some of y'all realize for like the longest time now. 90% of street hop is USDA prime grade bull defecate. And I mean, okay? Believe it or not, the old heads that I know who know better don't have any ill will toward Jay. Matter of fact, he is still to this day their favorite rapper for reasons that I'll discuss later on. If you ask me, Jay is the one responsible for turning the hood Hollywood. He took the streets from gritty to glamorous, creating a whole new subgenre in the process. Mafioso rap. Listening to Reasonable Doubt is like watching Scarface in like a quarter of the time. It's entertaining in a way that Illmatic can't be, or at least not to people like me. Again, keep that in mind for later. The issue with Jay was never really about him basing his whole persona on his cousin's life. Well, I guess I shouldn't have said that part out loud, should I? But Jay, in several different ways, made it clear that he wasn't really of the culture, because the culture couldn't be commodified in the 90s the way that it can and has been today. I don't know at what point in his career he became open about it, but Jay didn't really consider himself to be a rapper when doing so served the culture more than it did his own ends. You gotta remember, this was the 90s after all. Hip-hop didn't even get a Grammy category until 1995, and even then, none of those categories have ever been televised. Despite its proven commercial viability, hip-hop still wasn't really considered art by a lot of people who I guess opinions are supposed to matter, whatever. So basically what Jay said without saying it is, I am whatever makes me the most marketable to the most people possible. Kind of sounds like somebody we know, right? All right, so because I know the Jay stands are probably in the comments already frothing at the mouth while they search for that one quote that Jay had about the Grammys' disrespect toward hip-hop, I admittedly could not find any instance where Jay just flat out said he wasn't a rapper, except those instances in which such could be taken as jest. So if that is an L to be held, I will hold it for what that's worth. That said, on several different occasions and in several different ways, Jay has indicated in no unequivocal terms that he doesn't really see himself as part of the culture, and in some cases even above it, something that he has continuously been called out on, most recently by Cameron, from his choice to eschew every one of the plethora of Hip Hop 50 celebration performances in favor of performing for a bunch of rich white folks at Tom Brady's Hall of Fame party, to his own admission of not actually listening to rap music beyond what he makes himself. And no, I'm not talking about any of the Lil Young niggas today. I'm talking about like one of his first interviews ever. He says this.
Who you check for, Jay?
I like everybody, but you know, I really listen to Seal and Prince and things like that. As far as the lyricist thing go, you gotta realize once again, rap is also a business now. It's a big business.
Huge business.
You know what I mean?
Point being, if you want to be pedantic about it, then okay, Jay-Z never actually said he wasn't a rapper, at least to the best of my knowledge. That said, okay, nigga, whatever. Point still stands. And I mean, okay, again, I get why some purists might have a problem with Jay saying the quiet part out loud, but that's the thing. Just because it is quiet doesn't mean it's not true. Like I said before, hip-hop has always at least attempted to be mainstream, but kayfabe has always said that hip-hop is supposed to be for the streets, or at least for the hood. Even still, that's not really the only issue that folks have with Hov. Like I'll discuss in a later video, a lot of hip-hop culture is taken directly from the streets, including the whole mentor-protege dynamic. Traditionally, you're supposed to find a mentor or vice versa, and then pay your dues learning the craft and the business while under that person's tutelage, and then use the lessons that they taught you to create your own style. Think Nas and Large Professor, Birdman and Wayne, Jay and Ye, coincidentally enough. I forgot to mention this in the diss track video, but this is another big reason why I think a lot of today's artists make a career out of just making the same 3 songs over and over again, and in Ice Spice's case, is just repeating the same 3 bars. Well, for a young Jay-Z, that mentor was Jaz-O, but it was also Big Daddy Kane, kinda, and then Herb McGruff at one point, and then apparently Biggie Smalls. My point being, Jay never really stayed under the wing of any one person long enough for that person to really be OG. Instead, he sought out the hottest rapper he could find, hung around long enough to build clout, and then hopped on to the new hot thing smoking. Y'all are seeing the pattern here, right? A Canadian one. Furthermore, just like my ex, Jay took a small part of each rapper that he ran with and then turned himself into like hip hop Mega Man or something. And I mean, okay, I'm talking about Jay, not my ex. I still feel some type of way about that. I'm healing, y'all. By this point in the timeline, everybody was basically copying somebody else. Every rapper since like 1987 is basically a Rakim clone. The problem is more so with the fact that aside from that one feature that Jazz had, Jay never really credited his predecessors properly until he was called out for it. That was the whole point of Ether again. You can't be the God MC if your whole gimmick is just Yuda's copy technique from JJK. Yes, I do know Game Weebs. Ask about me. But even that is not the whole story behind the shade for Jay. And in order to understand that, we have to talk about the other album I briefly referenced earlier. I really shouldn't have to explain why Ready to Die is so important even to the casual hip-hop head, but it suffices to say that Ready to Die is the template for Reasonable Doubt, and honestly, most of mainstream hip-hop for like the 10 years after it. Big's debut was the one that introduced us to the Big Papa persona that became his legacy on Life After Death, and that was by design, just not Big's, but Puff's. Puff P. Daddy was largely responsible for the duality of the notorious B.I.G. While Big was focused on the menacing and at times introspective, even paranoia-ridden and dread-filled street bars of his, Puff was the brain behind the persona that wrote Big Papa, One More Chance, and Hypnotized. Matter of fact, Big wrote anywhere from most to all of Lil' Kim's debut, not to mention Lil C's and the rest of Junior Mafia, along with some credits for Mace and, honestly, the rest of Bad Boy besides maybe Craig Mack, I guess. The problem was that Big wasn't getting paid for any of that. Matter of fact, Big was barely getting paid for his own records, which is why Big secured a $62 million deal to leave Bad Boy right before he died, which is why a lot of people believe that even if Puff didn't orchestrate it, he didn't really do all he could have to prevent Big's murder. And I mean, just don't let the wrong person see this video. The point I'm getting at is, along with Big's bars, Jay inherited Big's persona and made it his own by Life and Times Volume 1 with the help of Puff P. Daddy, no less, who is a co-producer on that record, thus effectively ushering in the bling era of hip-hop, and in the process beginning the severance of hip-hop from the radically black politic that had defined it since at least the mid-'80s. Jay-Z's place in hip-hop history is a complicated one, to say the least, is what I'm trying to say. While he does have the resume to support his GOAT contention, whether consciously or not, Jay did nearly as much as Puff to turn street hop into hip-hop. Worse than that, he did so while presenting himself as an outsider of the culture on purpose. Basically, what I'm saying is Jay-Z is a colonizer, but only because he made himself so. And until like the last, I don't know, maybe decade or so, he didn't really seem to show any regret for that. In his lifetime, Jay has been a mob boss, a pimp, Damon John, Louis Farrakhan, Basquiat, and a Hawaiian shirt enthusiast. But none of that is the real Sean Carter. He's been telling us who he is for years in whispers, but it wasn't until that Diamonds feature that he finally said out loud what we'd all been saying about him for years. Jay-Z is not just a brand. He is a business. Capital is not just his primary motivator. That is his whole sense of self. Like I said earlier, even if he'll never admit it, I feel like Jay's most recent persona is in part a way to make amends and reconnect with the culture after years of unabashed commodification. There comes a point in everyone's life, I believe, when they begin to contemplate legacy. And when it is all said and done, those who know better, those who know that ether is deeper than dick-sucking camels, those who remember the Hawaiian shirts and the Biggie bars, those who remember every time he actively distanced himself from the culture while milking it for as much money and power as possible, will have to reconcile Jay's musical genius with his ruthless ambition. Regardless of what mainstream publications have to say, sadly, this is the reason why Jay will probably never be a serious GOAT candidate, according to the culture at least, despite his resume. And more importantly, this is why, in my opinion, the first Drake wasn't LL Cool J. It was Jay-Z. Or at the very least, he was close enough to make the possibility of Drake a threat worth gatekeeping. Like I said, by the late 90s, mainstream hip-hop had largely abandoned the 6-inch butters and the 5X parkas for shiny suits and whatever the hell Puff had on in that Mo Money, Mo Problems video. Hip hop as a whole was becoming increasingly more materialistic and honestly pretty vapid as an art form. And I mean, like, yeah, you still had your Outkast, you still had Nas, you still had Lauryn Hill for like a year, plus the members of Black Star. But for the most part, mainstream hip hop was becoming ever more superficial around the turn of the millennium. And remember, that was by design. That radical, even rebellious identity politic I mentioned earlier was effectively reduced to just an aesthetic now. But at the very least, that aesthetic was still black as hell. That's why Drake couldn't have worked 20 years ago, if you ask me. His presentation is just too divorced from the kind of blackness to which mainstream outlets had grown accustomed to seeing from rappers, and more importantly, what they expected from them. But that's where our next candidate comes in. Jeffrey Bruce Atkins was born and raised in Hollis, Queens, which has always been kind of an incubator for hip hop culture, giving us the likes of Run DMC, Russell Simmons, and it was actually one of the neighborhoods that LL grew up in his youth. And another pretty important figure to this story that we'll come back to later. Jeff's father left the home when he was a boy, and due to his mom's work schedule, lived with his grandparents until he was around 12 or 13. At which point he moved back in with his mom and started hustling, according to his own account, to help his mom make ends meet. This is also around the time Jeff took on the moniker that we would all know him by today, Ja Rule. Ja formed the group Cash Money Clique in the early 90s, and independently they released their first single around 96 or so with the help of fellow Hollis resident, a young DJ Irv, the future Irv Gotti. Cash Money Clique wound up building enough buzz to be signed to a record deal, a deal that Irv helped broker, and planned to release their debut album until one of the members wound up catching a 5-year bid, causing the group to be dropped, and they ultimately disbanded not long after. Not a problem though, because right around the same time, Irv was hired by Def Jam as an A&R, and one of his first big acquisitions was none other than Jeffrey Atkins. Due to his success in helping produce Reasonable Doubt, along with signing DMX and co-producing his classic debut, Def Jam granted Irv his own imprint in 97 or 98-ish, which he and his brother Chris wound up naming Murder Inc., with their flagship artist being none other than Ja Rule. For the rest of the 90s, Ja was featured on a bunch of tracks for a number of hip-hop heavyweights, including Nas, DMX, and LL Cool J, coincidentally enough, and even Dru Hill, tapping into that coveted R&B audience. But none was bigger than Jay-Z's Can I Get Her in 98. To that point, his biggest single, and the lead one off of Life and Times Volume 2, Jay's first album to reach #1 on the Billboard 200. Ja followed that feature with his own debut solo album the next year, which peaked at #3 on the Billboard 200. But more importantly, in 2000, he released Between Me and You, an obvious attempt at crossover appeal, which wound up working out for him, reaching #11 on the Hot 100. But more importantly, it set the stage for Ja's biggest single and probably his signature song. Put It On Me became the second single off Ja's sophomore album, and this marked his complete severance from the East Coast street hop sound of his early career to the top 40 friendly bops that would have become his legacy. It's hard to articulate how big this song was back then, but for reference, it was the first one to be retired on 106 in Park after spending 2 months on the countdown. And I mean, you got to remember, this was back in the days when BET still mattered to anyone under the age of 45. The countdown shows were the pulse of the culture back then. Making it on 106 or TRL was basically the sign that you had made it. You were a bona fide superstar, at least in the eyes of that coveted tween, teen, and 20-something demographic. Off the back of Ja, Murder Inc. became the biggest rap label in the world for like a year. And Ja himself was the biggest rapper for like the same amount of time. He had the look. He had bars, kinda. Not really, but he was competent. And he had the charisma. And he was also from New York at a time when that still mattered. But more importantly, he had the backing of the streets, both through his own IRL clout and probably more importantly, that of his manager. The difference between Ja and other pop-adjacent rappers of the time, like Nelly and Ludacris, for example, is aside from neither of them being from either East or West Coast, neither of them were ever seen as street dudes by the culture and, more importantly, by the mainstream consumer. Thus, they were never really taken seriously as flag bearers for the hip-hop genre. That's the thing I think gets lost in an era in which Jack Harlow was crowned next up at one point. Hip-hop's heart is in the black inner-city experience.
I'm vanilla, baby.
If your sound doesn't resonate with or reflect that experience, it's not going to register as authentic to the audience of that genre, or at least that's what it was back then. Ja was a street rapper who just made the transition to the mainstream. Thus, the streets accepted him as authentic. Ja Rule was what the gatekeepers intended LL to be and what he could have been if he really wanted to be that. And what Jay-Z at least attempted to be, but never quite managed to get to. Again, like I said in a previous video, Ja Rule was Drake, and I'm not exaggerating. His legacy isn't just his commercial success, but the fact that he is largely the reason why rappers during this period started making a conscious effort toward a more pop-conscious sound, or at least having 2 or 3 ballad-adjacent tracks on their albums, if that makes any sense. What I'm saying is, before Ja Rule became shorthand for Hold This L, he was set up to be not just the biggest rapper, but probably the biggest, at least male pop star of the next half decade or so, if not for one man. Okay, so in order to properly understand the 50 Ja beef, we have to go to the streets, specifically the streets of South Jamaica, Queens. See, despite Ja's former dope boy status, he didn't actually grow up in the streets. Matter of fact, there's an argument that Ja is not even from the hood. Hollis is actually a middle-class neighborhood, or at least it was back in the 80s. I don't really know what it's like now, but the thing is that this was the crack era. Crack in the 80s was like Ozempic is now. It was everywhere. If you weren't doing it yourself, then you at least knew somebody who was if you weren't selling it. Jamaica, Queens, however, actually is everything rappers say it is, or at least it was back in the 80s. Again, I don't really know much about New York. This is where Curtis Jackson was born and raised by his single mother, who made her living as a dope dealer before dying in the fire when Curtis was just 8, at which point he moved in with his grandparents. So yeah, another Kendrick LP in the works. Curtis was already in the streets by the time he was 12 and did his first bid in 1994, serving 6 months in a juvenile boot camp for possession. In 96, Curtis, who was going by 50 Cent by this point, was introduced to Jam Master Jay, who taught him how to actually write and structure songs, which, if you ask me, wound up becoming 50's signature skill, and the one that ultimately helped him usurp Ja less than a half decade later. Around the same time that Ja was being groomed for mainstream success, 50 was developing a pretty strong buzz underground before signing to Columbia and releasing Power of the Dollar in 2000, with the lead single How to Rob, which, in addition to being one of the funniest tracks ever, that basically just lays out in intimate detail how he would literally rob every hip-hop heavyweight at the time, was featured on the soundtrack for Into Deep, a movie that stars none other than LL freaking Cool J as a street boss named God. Like, you can't tell me the big man doesn't have a sense of humor, man. This version of 50 Cent is the one that the streets rallied around and thus had the clout to take down a dude as big as Ja Rule. Again, during this era, the trick was finding the balance between street and mainstream credibility, but not necessarily for the reasons that a lot of y'all might think, and we will come to that later. I know y'all are getting tired of me teasing y'all like this, but hey, that's the story of my sex life, so No, not really. My wife is actually just as thirsty as I am. Put a ring on it, fellas. That's the best advice I can give you. But the argument can be made that Ja was so big at this point that his street clout didn't really matter anymore. I mean, that is until 50 Cent became unexpectedly just as relevant in the mainstream consciousness as Ja without sacrificing any of that street edge that made him so popular underground to begin with. But why and how did he get that edge to begin with? Yeah, that's how. 50's near date with death was literally the best thing to happen to his career, at least. Matter of fact, the second or third best diss track of all time, in my opinion, is based on that fact.
I don't got a problem with clout. You ain't get shot again yet, so what's your second album about? No.
I had to shout out Jadakiss in here. I just had to, man. Like, I'm not even joking. 50 was so messed up after that attempt on his life that he pretty much had to relearn how to walk. And it was that led him to developing the workout routine that turned him into Ghetto Mandingo. Basically, he was food in the streets and effectively blacklisted from the industry as a result. So 50 fled to the Poconos to go and get healthy, after which point he went to Canada to record with the help of Sha Money XL, who wound up basically becoming G Unit's in-house producer later on. You can hear him being shouted out in a bunch of their records from the time. You can go check that out in your own time. The important part is that this period produced the Guess Who's Back mixtape, which 50's lawyer at the time handed to a colleague of his, who was at the time Eminem's manager. And yeah, y'all pretty much already know the rest of the story. 50's meteoric rise was in a lot of ways a reaction to Ja's crossover. The common narrative is that Ja had the radio, but 50 had the streets, which is why 50 ultimately came out on top, which isn't wrong, but as most things on YouTube is pretty reductive. Interscope, and for that matter, Dre, and 50 himself definitely knew what they were doing with the whole bulletproof gimmick. Thanks to gangsta rap's takeover of the genre a decade earlier, the record companies understood that there was more than one way to make hip-hop mainstream. The formula that made 50 Cent into the hottest rapper in the world for like 2 years is the same one that Jay-Z was trying to use for himself just, 5 years earlier? The problem was with the way that Jay presented it. Remember how I told y'all to take notes? Well, it's pop quiz time, nigga. Who did I say was my people's favorite rapper growing up? Do you know why he was? Check your notes again, Bucko. Remember what movie I compared Reasonable Doubt to? Street niggas like Jay for the same reason Scarface is considered a hood classic by some, and why Power has stayed on so long that it has more spinoffs than a Beyblade tournament. Yeah, that was a very dorky reference, but I am that I am. Jay's music, at least for like the first, 2 or 3 LPs, is a power fantasy at heart. It is what the average dope boy aspires to become when they enter the game. It's not meant to make you say drugs are bad, okay? It's meant to make you say, damn, I bet it feels good to be a gangster. Or, damn, I wish I knew better before I got into this BS, if you really know better. That's why, honestly, aside from my pops, who, at least legally speaking, is as clean as Colgate, none of my OGs really listen to Nas like that. And while we are on Nas, let me just take a second to retract something I said in the last video. I'm sorry for the "it was written" slander. It's not Black Panther B-sides. It's Damn. And I will go no further. I'm sorry, Nas, you're still my favorite MC. I gotta keep it a buck on these videos, man. Whatever. Moving on. Like we said earlier, Jay saw himself as a pop artist using rap as a vehicle. His whole goal was to make the streets accessible to the suburbs. And in a lot of ways, he succeeded in doing just that. The problem was that Jay's presentation was a little too glamorous for its own good. Like I said in How the Hood was commodified, a lot of suburbanites listen to street hop for the same reason they watch horror movies or ride roller coasters. They get to have their thrill with none of the danger attached to it. Unless we're talking about a carnival ride, stay off those things for the love of God. Part of the reason Kendrick's music resonates with so many white people, if you ask me, is because of how vivid a picture of hood life he paints on albums like Section 80 and GKMC. White people, or at least a significant portion of white people, love Kendrick for the same reason they watch, I don't know, Snowfall or The Wire or Boys in the Hood or whatever. They're fascinated by poverty, even if they're too scared to experience its effects personally. Like I keep saying, this is why channels like Trap Lord Ross remain so popular, and why nobody, and I mean absolutely no freaking body, does as much hard drugs or as much freaky-ish as rich white 20-somethings. Except politicians, maybe. They're bored. I know this. I went to a PWI after all. I've seen y'all in your natural habitat, and I don't ever need to see that again. Like, jokes aside, that was way more traumatizing than even watching my uncle detox. But just because they're bored, it doesn't mean they're dumb. Even the cul-de-sac dweller can listen to Jay's music and know like 90% of it is cap. It's not real enough. It's not raw. It's not gritty the way that Illmatic is. But Get Rich or Die Trying was. Get Rich or Die Trying is basically what Nas spent the 6 years between Ill and Stillmatic trying and failing to make. The perfect balance between street hop and hip hop. I'm not saying that 50 is anywhere near the rapper that Nas or Jay are, but what I am saying is, if you ask me, he writes better songs, to keep it a buck. That, along with his natural marketing skills, put him on a level equal to Ja in like half the time. Again, 50 had clout with the streets, not just for his rap sheet, but his prolific mixtape catalog, along with that first album. 50 also knew how to pop it up for MTV when need be. I also think we can't overstate how big an asset 50's physique was for him. He and Ja also, to be honest, just projected that kind of hyper machismo that Jay never really did. Again, Jay, like Big before him, always presented as the smooth talking kingpin, whereas 50 and Ja were the hardened street thug who goes soft for his lady from time to time, but in the good way. Y'all know what I'm trying to say. Like I've said umpteen 11 times on this channel, that is what popular culture assumes black masculinity is. Our manhood is primarily, even exclusively at times, based in our physicality. And I mean, who would you rather run fade with? A prime J or a prime 50? Yeah, I rest my case, man. What I'm saying is, 50 was the perfect foil for Ja because he wasn't just street. He was street and pop. And thanks to those 9 bullet holes in his body, he was popular enough already that he never needed to fully cross over the way Ja did to reach the pop charts. And that's why 50 won. But that then begs the question, what did he do to make them niggas that mad? What did Ja do to make that nigga so mad in the first place? Matter of fact, why was 50 fooled even after he was shot? And why was he effectively exiled from both the industry and his home turf until he basically forced his way back in? All right, I guess I'm going to have to enter into Trap Lord territory. Damn! Kenneth McGriff, aka Supreme, was what Jay-Z thinks you think he is. Throughout the 80s, the Supreme team, based out of South Jamaica, damn near monopolized the drug game in that borough, making Preem one of the biggest drug kingpins in the entire city. You can learn more about that by watching Al Prophet's channel, one of the only true crime channels that I will endorse, or one of the many other videos and documentaries made about Supreme Team, because this ain't that channel and I'm doing my best to make sure it stays that way. Anyway, if y'all been paying attention, do you know that this is around the same time that a young Curtis Jackson hit the streets in the same neighborhood? So who do you think his OG was? Preem wound up taking Curtis under his wing, and 50 became something of a protege to him, often being seen riding around Southside with Preem and his nephew Gerald Miller, aka Prince. Keep that in mind for later, by the way. There will be another quiz. Not really, just keep it in mind, nigga, man. like repeating myself. Well, as is basically customary for dope dealers, Preem wound up serving a total of 7.5 of a 12-year bid between the years of 1989 and 97. When Preem was released, he had sense to know he was going to need to find another stream of income, either because he knew he dodged a bullet with that first bid, or more likely because by the mid-90s, crack was indeed whack. Thank you, Dare.
You going straight to a jail cell.
And Whitney Houston.
Your crack is whack.
Well, Preem's first attempt to go straight during this period was to make a movie based on the Crime Panther novels, and to do so, he enlisted the help of his old buddy, Irv Gotti. It's all coming together like butt cheeks in the strip club. Now, I nor anybody but Irv, Chris, and Preem himself can really tell you how much stake Preem had in Murder Inc.'s success, but what we do know is that it was enough for Irv and Chris to be indicted on money laundering and conspiracy charges, leading to that infamous raid on Murder Inc. HQ that led to that whole rebrand that nobody really remembers because they were basically irrelevant by the end of the next year anyway. More importantly, though, we know that both Irv and Jay-Z offered Preem an executive role at both their respective labels, but Preem turned them both down because he just couldn't divorce himself from street life, I guess. So where does 50 come into all of this? Well, if we haven't learned anything else about Curtis over like the past 20 years that he's spent in public consciousness, is that he is both hypersensitive and super duper retaliatory. It's generally accepted that the 50 and Job beef began in earnest when Job had his chain snatched by one of 50's associates, an incident that 50 still claims he had no prior knowledge of, but we also know that 50 claims it really started when Job slighted him at a club before the chain snatching incident, which is why 50 theorizes that Job blamed him for said chain snatching. But here's my theory. 50, being 50, saw Ja getting the attention that Preem once showed him and felt slighted because as far as he was concerned, Preem's cosign was as good as a golden ticket. Remember, like we discussed earlier, in the pre-SoundCloud days, because the hustlers were the ones with the resources, pretty much every one of your favorite MCs were like a degree or two of separation at most from the urban underworld. Yes, even the so-called conscious and clean rappers like Will Smith and MC Hammer. Matter of fact, it's still kind of wild to me that to this day people still try to clown the clean rappers, and worse yet, they'll call acts like NWA raw and real hip-hop when everybody in NWA except for Eazy-E were basically cosplaying gangbangers. Matter of fact, they had the nerve to clown each other for it once they fell out. Like, Dre, nigga, you were dressed up like a Earth, Wind, and Fire cover band for like the year before Straight Outta Compton was released. Matter of fact, more times than not, the so-called corny rappers like Hammer and Will actually had more street clout than the Play Thugs did. Yes, Big Willie is legit in West Philly. Look it up. Anyway, my point is, if you ask me, 50 already had it out for Ja from jump, and Ja's ego ain't do him any favors. That's why 50 started coming for Ja so hard after the chain snatching incident, even making reference to it in several diss tracks against Ja. But again, Ja was the meal ticket, and we know that 50 was admonished several times through third parties to lay off of him. And all that did was fill 50's jealous rage. Then Ghetto Quran came out. Yeah, I really shouldn't be talking about this part. One of you cornbread niggas, come check on me after this. I'm serious. Y'all have my number, man. Ghetto Quran is the closest thing to dry snitching you're ever going to hear on wax. Well, before Murder on My Mind, that is. 50 names drops a plethora of New York street heavies, including Preem himself, Prince, Fat Cat Nichols, Pappy Mason, Bimmy Anthony, among others, as well as describing in intimate and specific details their exploits and even bragging about doing so at one point. Okay, so everything that I'm about to say is alleged, but this is just my and honestly a lot of other people who know much better and much more than I's take. That said, I'm serious about that phone call, man. The word is that this was the last straw for Preem. So he sent his boys, allegedly, to handle the work, allegedly. And that's how the bulletproof gimmick was born, along with that signature slur of 50s. The feds actually released an affidavit that all but confirms that Preem conspired with, quote, other rap artists that have 50 killed for Ghetto Quran, and the Murder Inc. employees at the very least knew of the plot. So yeah, 50 blames Ja, or at least Irv, for him being shot, and Ja blames 50 for his fall off. And I mean, point is, these two are going to beef until the rapture, and probably after. Matter of fact, 50's hate for Ja goes so deep that Ja is pretty much the reason behind any of his other beefs that matter besides the game and Jay, basically. 50's place in this story is important for two reasons. Ja was what LL could have been if he had Jay's mindset. And the only reason his place in hip-hop history is a footnote now is because his worst enemy came along and did it better. The common misconception about 50's place in hip-hop history is that he sold out once he went mainstream. But the truth is, 50 was always pop. He was just as street at the same time, until the streets decided they were tired of hearing him sing. That's the gift and the curse of the 50 Cent formula, and ultimately why his star faded just as fast as it was formed. At this point in the timeline, hip-hop was still street enough that you couldn't have one foot in both pools for too long. You had to pick a side and live with the choice, for better or for worse. That's what Ja did, and why he would have been all right, to be honest, if 50 didn't clip him at the knees. Because the stone cold reality is, the streets, even back then, didn't matter as much as people thought they did. But the majority of people just didn't realize or wanted to admit that yet. 50 didn't blow up because he played to both crowds. He blew up because he was a better Ja Rule than Ja Rule. For as pop as 50 made himself, in his heart, he's a street kid. So when the streets turned on him, 50 being 50, he just couldn't live with that. That's why he spent all that time after Curtis, time that he really should have used to go back to the drawing board, going back and forth with the likes of The Lox, Cameron, and a bunch of other niggas that, to be honest, didn't really matter much outside of the streets. I'm sorry, Kiss. It's the truth. I still love y'all, though. It's hard being honest sometimes. And I don't know. Part of me says that's kind of commendable, even admirable, that 50 never really forgot where he came from, even if he fronted like he did. But then again, there's a reason why Jay never really took that beef with Dipset seriously. And when he did clap back, the whole crew, Biggs and Dame too, got like a bar and a half, not even a whole track. Ja, on the other hand, his failure wasn't even his disconnect from the streets, but that he stopped being a gangster, according to the pop girlies. Because of their ties to 50, pretty much every other mainstream rapper that mattered was coming for Ja at the height of his powers, and Ja did nothing until it was already too late. Like I said in the diss track video, whether fair or not, once a diss is put out in the open, especially when it's explicitly aimed at you, you're on the clock now. And you only have so much time to clap back before the public has made up their mind about you. By the time Ja tried to go back to his street hop ways, the writing had been on the wall for a good year or two. The game was over, and Ja got blown out the building in Game 5 of a best of 7. The legacies of 50 Cent and Ja Rule are intertwined with or without the beef, because they showed the industry what a mainstream rapper looked like in the early aughts. I'm going to be real with y'all. When I started writing this script, my point was to prove that Ja Rule was the first Drake. But then I started thinking and I realized that Ja wasn't the first Drake. He was actually the first Young Thug. We forget that though, because again, 50 just did it better. But look at T.I., look at Busta, look at Wayne, Luda, every other mainstream rapper in the aughts, and even today we're using Ja's formula to cross over. Well, that or Kanye's. I mentioned in the diss track video that every like decade or so, hip hop resets itself. I don't really know why. I think a lot of it is just due to fatigue, but it's practically inevitable at this point. So yeah, if this Kendrick Drake beef is anything to go by, get ready for a whole decade's worth of triple entendre, self-reflection, and religious allegories for American blackness, Drake stands. I have absolutely no sympathy for any of you. By the mid-aughts, street hop had kind of run its course, is what I'm saying, due largely to the fact that street hop had lost the plot by leaning so hard into the sex, money, murder side that the struggle side of it was relegated to, at best, a track or two if it showed up on the LP at all. Again, what made Illmatic and 36 Chambers so beloved both in the streets and the record stores was their unflinching portrayal of poverty and its repercussions. DMX became the biggest rapper of the at least 98 and 99, not just for how aggressive he was, but because that aggression came from a real place of pain. That's basically DMX's whole catalog, and honestly his whole identity in a nutshell, to be honest. The late Pimp C spent much of his later years bemoaning this very fact, that hip-hop was losing its authenticity if it hadn't already. There was no message in the music anymore. There was no substance. In other words, street hop was hip-hop by this point. And all we really heard on the radio was Dat or Snap Jones, which have never been accused of being anything but mindless turn-up music. Again, thank you, Prem. And I mean, I did spend a whole section of the script saying that's what Biggie and Jay did, but I mean, come on, man. Are we really going to sit here and compare two legit GOAT candidates to T.I. and Young Jeezy? I remember being in high school when Wayne started coming on strong, and the running joke was that Wayne became the best rapper by default. It wasn't that he had gotten any better from his Hot Boy days, but just that the competition was practically in the gutter. And I mean, y'all can agree or disagree. In hindsight, I think that was kind of harsh, to be honest, but the mid-aughts was not the 90s in terms of skill or messaging, is what I'm saying. So the public was horny for an alternative. And they got it in College Dropout.
Kanye West, everyone. This is the real one, baby. Got Selena on the vocals. The hip-hop violinist Mary Ben Ari. Yeah. Southside. We gon' set this party off right. Westside. Yo, John Legend, what's going on?
Kanye was a breath of fresh air because his music had the soul that much of modern hip-hop was lacking at the time, pun most definitely intended. The fact that he was conscious, I think, was kind of secondary to why he became so popular, but the fact that he was conscious opened the door for rappers of that ilk to be flowered by the mainstream finally. This is the era where we got Lupe and Big Crit, veteran backpackers like Common, Killer Mike, the members of Gang Starr, among others, were finally getting their flowers from the culture after years of being relegated to also ran status. Kanye proved, if nothing else, that you didn't have to be street to be successful, and consequently showed mainstream audiences that there was more to being black than big muscles and street hustles. Matter of fact, like I said earlier, being too street was becoming a detriment more than a blessing now. Kanye changed what being a rapper looked and even sounded like. You could rap about blackness without being a dope boy or a gangbanger and cross over in the process. And that's the rub right there. Kanye's first 3 LPs or so were full of references to blackness, from shouting out Black Planet to the Reagan Did It references to the Touch the Sky video that featured Nia Long and Tracy Ellis Ross back when she was still Joan from Girlfriends and before her glutes grew 3 sizes. Kanye's connection to the culture was clear, and that's what resonated with it. It's not unlike Nas's Hotep bars or Pac's lyrical activism. Kanye was of the culture not because he was street, but because he was black and proud of that fact. Or at the very least, that's what he made us think until 808s and Heartbreak. This is kind of where Kanye begins to present himself as bigger than the culture, bigger than rap music, bigger than blackness even. The biggest rap artist in the world is a black man who doesn't identify with his blackness until it's beneficial. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But just as important, Kanye does something on 808s that I don't remember seeing a mainstream rapper do to that point. He displays a level of vulnerability that to that point was reserved for the R&B niggas. Even in songs like 21 Questions or the Many Clones after or before it, the narrator still projected that thug in love energy evocative of stereotypical black masculinity. Kanye didn't do that. He spent half the album practically crying in auto-tune about the evil ex who broke his heart and took his dignity with her. It's actually kind of eerie listening back to 808s and even some of the tracks off of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy and hearing the same kind of light misogyny and vindictiveness that would be Drake's calling card like 10 years later. But regardless, 808s for the ground it did break sonically. At EOD is just a slow, sad-ass, self-involved breakup album. And those are a white man's words, not mine. So you can keep your takes to yourself if Eminem is your favorite rapper. And I mean, that's not inherently a bad thing, but it's just not something we had heard a rapper do to that point. And that's because Kanye wasn't really a rapper at this point. He wasn't trying to be. 808s is all about Kanye coming to grips with transcending hip-hop to full-on pop stardom and the isolation he feels because of it. We've heard rappers show vulnerability before, again, DMX being a prime example of that, but not with so much bitch assness. Sorry, it is what it is. And definitely not over a breakup. And no other rapper as big as Kanye was at the time could do what Kanye did and not only survive, but arguably become bigger for it. By this point, Kanye's music ceased speaking to the black experience. He was speaking on his own celebrity more than he was anything else. And I mean, you can make the same argument for Jay in his post-Blueprint era, but the difference is Kanye made no bones about allowing that celebrity to overrule his blackness publicly. Something I've talked about in regards to other powerful black men who get on, and FD has done specifically when it comes to Kanye in like 2 separate hour-long videos. Unlike Jay, who used his celebrity to co-opt the very radicalism he eschewed in the 90s, Kanye presents himself less as a black man and more so a celebrity who so happens to be black. And it was that version of Kanye that made Drake possible. Even if it's not my cup of tea, there's nothing inherently wrong with 808s. That said, sonically, thematically, spiritually even, it's not a hip-hop album. Without Kanye, and more specifically, if he never makes 808s, Post Malone doesn't happen. Neither does Macklemore. There's an argument that even Mac Miller doesn't. And I mean, there's no shade to him. I'm just trying to make a point. Flower Boy and Igor don't get typecasted as hip-hop albums just because a hip-hop artist made them. But most importantly, Drake doesn't become the face of hip-hop. Kanye, more than any mainstream rapper that I can think of before him, divorced hip-hop from blackness in a way that made it purely pop music and thus opened the floodgates for colonization. So if you did use the chapters to skip the whole first, hour and I don't know how long plus of this video, firstly, eat a dick. Second, if you ask me, the first Drake wasn't LL Cool J. It wasn't Jay-Z. It wasn't Ja Rule or 50 Cent. But it was Kanye West. And as a former Ye fan myself, man, that's a hard pill to swallow. I'm not even going to lie. Even Eminem, a literal white man, maintained his tether to the culture throughout his career. M never tried to be anything other than a rapper's rapper at that, despite his stands in the industry alike trying their damnness to make him into a pop star. Furthermore, M never tried to position himself as the voice of the culture. He was really just doing his own thing. It just so happened that his thing resonated with a bunch of people who didn't like hip hop until someone who looked like them started doing it and doing it well. Like, I can't get away from LL, can I, man? This nigga. This is the big reason why M is respected in a way that I'd argue Jay, Ja, 50, and Ye aren't. The four guys I just mentioned and who I spent the bulk of this video talking about, whether consciously or not from jump or at a later point in their career, used hip hop as an avenue toward pop stardom to varying degrees of success, and thus laid the seeds for Drake to come along and perfect their formula. I hope I made it clear that my issue with Drake was never really with him personally, at least not for anything having to do with music. That's another video that I have no intention of ever doing. Like I've tried to argue for most of this video, there's always been a Drake-like figure in hip-hop consciousness since the days of Adidas tracksuits and Dookie chains. The difference is before Drake, each of those artists allowed their blackness to inform their branding. And I mean, that does open up a whole other conversation that I'm probably going to have later on that involves Doja Cat and DJ Academics, but that's all I'm giving y'all for now. But at least it was clear that whether mainstream or underground, that hip hop was unequivocally a black art form. Like I'll say in a later video, it's always when black people make something worth marketing that there's almost always an attempt explicitly to divorce it from the experience that informs it. But somehow we're the ones who are at fault for feeling a type of way about that. The math just ain't mathing to me, folks. And the reason is so simple, it might as well be a pre-math problem. White kids struggle to see themselves in anyone or thing that is unambiguously ethnic because white supremacy centers whiteness in every aspect of our society. The black experience is one that is altogether alien to the average consumer, and when it's not based in poverty, that's especially so. Regardless of how poor you were growing up or how many black friends you had or how much of that culture you consume, no one knows what it's like to be black except a black person. So when we make art that is explicitly informed by our experience, no matter how much you enjoy or even connect with it, there is still those one or two cultural barriers keeping you from fully connecting with it. And again, because white people are conditioned with main character syndromes from birth, a lot of y'all just can't accept that, just being real. That's why I keep seeing Eminem rated higher than Nas, Big, and Pac on these YouTube polls that keep popping up on my feed for some reason. But what if those barriers weren't there? What if you could have black culture without the black experience to make it make sense? That's what Drake is, and that's what he's always been. Again, the issue was never the ballads. It was never the biracialness or the BBL. It was he being the next logical step in hip-hop's commodification, colonization. He is exactly what I mean by loving everything about black people except the people personified. And that never sat right with me. But worse yet, that's what a lot of y'all wanted. And I'm not just talking about the whites, to be frank. I mentioned the culture industry earlier and the implications of such on the role that art actually plays in an advanced capitalist society. Call me crazy, but I'm of the opinion that art is supposed to be more than junk food, man. It's supposed to challenge as well as entertain. And listen, I'm not saying that there isn't a place for Marvel movies or Pound Town, but I feel like way too many people are comfortable with that being it. See, here's the thing that's always bothered me about the whole conscious rap discourse. What does the word conscious actually mean to some of y'all? Because if we're talking about consciousness in terms of just being aware of one's condition and the factors that have made one aware of that condition and expressing that condition in your art, then basically every rapper that mattered until, I don't know, Kanye and Drake displays some level of consciousness. I mean, even songs like Many Men and most definitely Hate It or Love It could be considered conscious rap in that regard.
When his kids starving, pockets going and Brenda still throwing babies in the garbage.
But since at least my teens, it feels like there's been a conscious effort to get away from that consciousness simply because, let's be real, most of us don't want to be challenged by what entertains us. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, I get why. We want vibes, we want feel good, we want mindless turn up music, as Prem so eloquently puts it. And I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with that. You can't give us free all day, every day. Believe me, I've tried. And it's not only exhausting, but it's one of the best ways to maintain celibacy. But what I am saying is no matter how good the dream is, at some point, you got to wake up and face the real world. A lot of us have turned our clocks off because that's easier than getting up and going to work. The problem is when we're getting those extra 2 or 3 hours recovering from the rave/revival service from the night before, HR already has another nigga lined up to interview for your position. I brought up Jay-Z's Black Power persona earlier, and I've also called he and Bey on the carpet for not living the life that their aesthetic stands for. Like I said before, I really couldn't care less about what celebrities have to say about politics because more often than not, they make me wish that they hadn't said anything in the first place. But that was never my point with Hove. As he did with hip hop, Hove, whether consciously or not, is reducing black liberation to just a vibe for the sake of fattening his own wallet. And the worst part is fewer and fewer people seem to care. Matter of fact, a lot of people not only don't see a problem with it, but they have more of a problem with you for pointing that out. They'll talk about the tax write-offs given to different orgs over the years, or the reform initiative he started with Meek. Y'all notice I'm trying to give Jay his props for what he has done right. And that's because despite what black capitalist talking points have taught y'all, my distaste for him has nothing to do with me being broke or being bitter or whatever other bullshit y'all come up with. Like I said earlier, I think there is a part of him that is sincere, but not enough to realize that he is the problem, or at least he's helping to perpetuate it. And the worst part is, again, a lot of us don't see it, or better yet, we don't want to see that. And that's the big issue with the culture industry. It conditions us for one-dimensional thought. It teaches us to avoid, even ignore our reality when it becomes too hard to swallow, instead of asking, how in the F did we get here in the first place? And better yet, how do we fix it? And again, that's all by design, nigga. I've said this in the past, and I'll keep saying that the biggest detriment to revolution in this country isn't the state, but it's us. It's our own complacency. Literal generations of planned obsolescence and convenience have lulled us into a collective false consciousness built on a pathological need to consume as much as quickly as possible, never stopping to ask if I really need to keep up with the Joneses, or better yet, why should I keep up with those mofos to begin with? But you know what I think? Somewhere in the deepest, darkest crevices of our minds, we already know this. Even if we won't vocalize it, we know the game and that we are being played by it. But the thing is, we don't care, or at least don't care enough to quit. But why though? Because for one reason or another, we're convinced that this is as good as it gets. An endless cycle of ceaseless toil that for a moment is interrupted by a brief reprieve of mindless turn-up entertainment. A vacation here, a movie there, a bar or two about pink coochies and brown booty holes. And I mean, yeah, we do need that from time to time, but that shouldn't be where we stop. If you ask me, a lot of people, myself included, have either tried so hard for so long to fix things with little or no success that we've thrown up our hands and said the best I can do is just make the best of what I got. And then there's others of us for whom, if we're going to be real, shit just hasn't gotten bad enough for us to find a better way. And the ghouls who run the movie studios, the record labels, the gaming publishers, the amusement parks, and every other part of the entertainment industry are all too happy to keep pumping us full of perks to dull the pain. If religion is the people's opium, then that religion is entertainment. And God help you if you ever blaspheme against it. Because it won't be the priests you have to answer to. It'll be the practitioners. I said this wasn't going to be that kind of video, but I mean, y'all should know me by now, so that's your own fault. But my point isn't to say that there isn't a place for junk food, but that can't be the staple of your diet, man. Or I mean, it can, and you'll have one less foot to walk on by the time you're 35. That was what soul food was all about, right? I don't know. That movie is almost 30 years old.
Hip hop from the beginning has been informed by the black experience, specifically that of the inner city. So it was inevitable that that experience would be translated through the art form. And yeah, if you have a problem with that, frankly, that's a you problem in it. But more importantly, it says more about your lack of empathy than your taste in music, to be quite frank. Hey, sorry, not sorry. The severance of hip hop from black oppression is no different than hiding the sweatshops that keep Jordans on the assembly line, or the blood minerals that make it possible to drop a new Android device every like 6 months. Someone suffered for us to have our sedative, is where I'm getting at. The very least we can do is acknowledge that suffering. Who knows? The more time you spend seeing the sausage get made, the less an appetite you may have for it. But that's kind of the problem, isn't it? Yeah, that's the end. Kind of dark, wasn't it?